You know, begging is an essential part of a healthy economy, though it has been frowned upon through all ages. But think about it. Right now I can sell you stuff because, for one, you believe that you need stuff. The truth is that in all likelihood, much of the stuff that you purchase you don't need. You may need a shirt, but you don't necessarily need a shirt with my brand on it. And you may not need so many as you have hanging in your closet. And so the more healthy you become in your thoughts about these things, the more likely it will be that you'll realize that you don't need the stuff that I may want to sell you. And of course, there's nothing to healthy us up financially and get us to a sound understanding. There's not anything that will so readily do that as financial instability, a downturn in the economy, recession, depression. And we think that this is the end of the world, but it's not really the end of the world. It just represents the end of our ability to purchase quite so much stuff. Now let's consider an economic downturn. Let's suppose that in a few weeks or a few months or a few years, everything comes crashing down for a time. Well, then that'll be a really interesting time, right? Everything's going to change. You're not going to be really so interested in my t-shirt with my fancy logo unless you can get it for really cheap or nothing. And the truth is that if you need a shirt, and I don't mean need my shirt, but if you need a shirt because you do not have one, then the only real appropriate thing for me to do is to give you one. When things get that bad, the only appropriate response to true, deep, and painful need is to give. Now, of course, you can continue on selling too. There usually is in almost all economic downturns. There are still people who can afford a shirt, people who can still afford even a fancy shirt, a shirt so fancy that it says the trackless path on it. So perhaps there's enough people buying that it makes sense to keep selling shirts. Or maybe not. Maybe I find out that I'm selling so few shirts that it's just not worth my time anymore. So then let's suppose that I realize that I'd better grow some food, right? I'd better get into the farming business because it's all about survival now. Well, that would be interesting. I haven't been a huge green thumb in my life, but maybe that's what I do. And I'm able to grow a little food. And maybe that's what everybody's just trying to do. And probably failing because we haven't been doing that for a long time, really. I mean, most people haven't been focusing on growing food. So supposing we're all trying, and some are succeeding and some are failing. But we're now down to the brass tacks, right? We're down to the point where we're not talking about extras, we're talking about essentials. And let's suppose that I encounter somebody who truly needs food. Now, obviously, I can't supply them forever, but for sure, if there's enough to divide and share, then the only appropriate response, the only appropriate thing to do is to give the food away because it's a true need. Now, usually in most economic downturns, there are still people who can afford food. Let's suppose that they've grown food on a large scale and they're able to sell some food and they have a little bit of money, or maybe they're able to sell shirts, because they found some way to make it financially viable. Well, great, so maybe I can sell some of my food. But were things to get bad enough, truly the only appropriate thing to do is to share, to love, even if we share our last meal together. And I think there's a providential power that guides us in such things. There are wolves, and we may not feel impressed to feed the wolves. Who knows? I can't foresee what that would look like. But one thing that I can foresee is that I can see myself, I can imagine myself. I hope that I can clearly imagine myself giving in the appropriate circumstance. So now the only thing that I'm producing, I'm giving away, which leaves me in a position of lack, which puts me in a position of needing to beg. Or another way of putting it is just needing to ask. I have a need. Can you fill it? And so that asking, that begging, is an essential part of a healthy economy. If a person feels free to ask, now of course the person they ask can say no, right? But if a person feels free to ask, then they will also feel more free to give. So that when it comes down to the brass tacks, we can retain our souls and not become mean and miserly. I'm going to finish up with a real quick story. It's from Laura Ingalls Wilder's book, The Long Winter. Recently read it. And here's the little story. It was a long winter. The whole little town that they lived in pretty much ran out of food. But they heard about a man that had grain. And they sent somebody to get the grain, to go try to buy the grain from the man. He lived out of town, and it was a harrowing trip just getting to him, and the people who went could have died. But the man refused to sell the grain. He said it was his seed grain for the coming year, and the emissaries from the town explained that people were about to starve. And the man's response was, "That's not my problem. They should have prepared." Eventually, they were able to convince the man to sell them the grain at a higher price than what he would have gotten in the spring. And they took it back to the town. Now, from what I understand, the money they spent, I believe, was the money of the storekeeper. And so it was really his grain they just bought, and he bought it so that he could resell it. And they brought it back, and the man who had the store immediately jacked up the price to a ridiculous amount. And the town was outraged. But his attitude was, "It's my grain. I can sell it for whatever price I want." And of course, the townspeople stated in no uncertain terms that if he chose to do this, they would never again buy from his store, or that they would do all they could not to buy from his store in the future, but that they were willing to pay a reasonable price. Eventually, the man saw that this was a bad move, and he lowered his price. I always loved The Little House on the Prairie. I always thought it was so heartwarming. It was interesting to discover how mean people could be way back then even. Human nature seems to be the same throughout all ages. But it does not have to continue to be so. It's time for the earth to be birthed. To be birthed? Is that the right word? I think to be born again, in a sense, into a new way of being, a new way of thinking. And it begins by embracing some of these new and radical ideas. Ideas like giving when it's appropriate, of sharing your last meal, and of being willing to ask. And so since this is an edition of the Beggar's Bowl, I would like to ask, do you by chance have a little change in your pocket that you can spare with me if you've found some value in the things that I've been sharing? Is it possible that perhaps you have 50 cents that you could share to help me to continue to be able to do this work and to provide for those I love? All right, and the way that you can do that is by sending it to my Venmo account, The Trackless Path, or to my PayPal account, thetracklesspath@gmail.com, or there is also a donate link on my website. So at least one of those avenues doesn't allow you to put 50 cents. You have to put a whole $1. I apologize for that. It's just the way it's programmed. Anyways, so thank you so much, and God bless you.